Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third Insight seminar for the semester. Thank you to our live audience here in the room, to our webinar participants at your terminals, wherever you may be across the globe, and to our telehealth guests as well. Welcome. Before we commence, I'd like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage of our land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We have a very special guest here today, the internationally renowned, Australian famous advocate and worker for a long time in the alcohol and drug sphere, particularly supporting families, Tony Trimingham from Family Drug Support. He's come all the way here from his home in New South Wales to join us today and to talk about what we can do to support families who have loved ones, significant others who have a lived experience of alcohol and drug issues, and including, as our focus is this semester, on families who use methamphetamine, drawing on his direct experience running Family Drug Support. So I'd like to welcome Tony to the microphone now to present to us. There is going to be time at the end for questions, and for webinar participants, please feel free to ask questions in your little panel dialogue box in the bottom right hand corner, and I'll be sure to ask them on your behalf to Tony as we go through the presentation. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage Tony Trimingham.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everybody. And sorry, I might be internationally well known, but I can't find my way down George Street to this place. So, sorry for being late. Yeah, and it's a lot warmer here than where I come from. I left Katoomba in the Blue Mountains yesterday, and it was about 8 degrees, and this is really hot for me. It's probably cool for you, but anyway, we're here. So yeah. Families are my business, and families are my passion, and that's what our organisation does. So we focus on supporting families and helping them to deal with complex drug and alcohol issues, and I'll go through how we do that this morning. So we were established in 1997 by accident. I lost my son to a heroin overdose in 1997. I discovered he was using heroin about 15 months prior to his death. He'd been using for about 18 months, and of course that was a huge shock. I handled it like all other families that we ever encounter handled it. In other words, not very well. I was not very well informed. But I guess the main thing about those times was that I couldn't find any support. I couldn't access any support. The only support that I accessed was really telling me to do things that I couldn't do. I went against the grain, the kind of tough love way of dealing with this. So I did what most other families do in those circumstances. We handled it on our own. And again, not particularly well, because I realized I knew nothing. That was 19 years ago. I've learned a lot since. And I never stopped learning. So the organization started about 7 months after Damien died, and it came about by me reading his death certificate and coroner's report and wanting to know more, making inquiries of people who were experts, and realizing that he just shouldn't have died. That's the long and short of it, that these deaths were preventable. But at that time in Australia, we were losing 4 people a day on average. And nothing seemed to be working. And then there was some sort of enterprising people who were trying to do things like introduce prescription heroin and injecting centres and things like that. But they were just being drowned out by politicians. And it was after a visit to my local MP, and I couldn't sleep that night, that I wrote a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald. The letter's editor said, "This is too big a letter to put in the letters page. We'd like to feature it." It appeared in the paper, and then I was bombarded with media, and I had literally every media outlet in Australia wanting to talk to me for a couple of days. And in the end, we did a program for Channel 7 called Witness, which was an hour-long special on heroin. And after that program went to air, I then started to be bombarded with phone calls from families across Australia who were telling me that my story was their story, that there were very common features. One of the people who contacted me was a person who's well known in New South Wales. You may even have heard of him up here, called Reverend Bill Cruz, who runs a program called Exodus, where he educates the underprivileged, he feeds the underprivileged, and he's worked with alcohol and drug people for 30 years. He was part of the Wayside Chapel when it started. And Bill rang me one day and just said, look, we've been rabbiting on about this for a long time. Let's have a public meeting and see if we can do something about it. So we did, and I started to tell people who were ringing me about this meeting, and in the end 400 people turned up to this little church in Ashfield, New South Wales, which normally holds about 200 people. They crammed in, and we had invited experts to speak, but unfortunately for the experts, they didn't get much chance because the families took over, and personal story after personal story. And at the end of the meeting, there was that much energy and need in the room that we realized we couldn't leave it. So we called for volunteers. We started a small committee and started having weekly meetings to support people. And that's where it all started. We had no idea, no money, but we got a lot of media. And that in turn drew attention from Bob Carr, the New South Wales Premier, who rang me and ended up having a 2-hour meeting with me, and he gave us $30,000. What were we going to do with this $30,000? We decided to start a national telephone line. I mean, that was the most naive thing. We didn't even limit it to New South Wales. We made it national. And somehow we're still here 19 years later. We've never had enough money. We're always fighting to survive, but our service keeps growing. We've actually been in Queensland working since the year 2000. Again, we got a small grant from the then Lord Mayor, who was Jim Sawley, which meant that we started support groups and started to train volunteers. But after that initial donation from the council and Jim Sawley then retiring, and a guy called Campbell Newman became the Lord Mayor. That ended our funding from Brisbane City Council, and we've never been able to get money from Queensland Health in all that time. And yet we still operate here. We still run 2 support groups regularly. We run our Stepping Stones program 2 or 3 times a year. We do volunteer training. And we take about 3,500 calls out of our 33,000 from Queensland. So it's about time Queensland recognised that, I think, and we're trying hard to get some money. Oh, that one, okay. So,
Or that one.
which one, this one? So that's our mission statement. Everybody has a mission statement, of course. We like to really live ours, and we make sure that everybody associated with FDS does, from our staff, which is small, to our volunteers, which is large. We've got 140 volunteers all around Australia, including about 20 or more in Queensland. And as I said right at the start, our energies are to support families struggling as a result of drug use. So we put families right at the centre of the jigsaw puzzle, and everything else we do is around that. So we have a 24-hour telephone support service, 33,000 calls last year. It looks like we're going to get about 36,000 this year. And we do that with the help of those 140 volunteers. We have regular open local support groups, 2 in Queensland, 17 in total. We run a program called Stepping Stones. That's a 28-hour structured course that guides families through the whole process of dealing with drugs in the family. We have resources. We have membership, and some of the resources are over there for you to have a look at. Membership includes our resource, A Guide to Coping, which I think is the best thing any family in Australia could get if they want to find out about how to deal with drugs. We do a little bit of counselling, not much. People like Dom do a bit in their work. Dom actually is funded by the federal government. Talking about Dom Shelley, the project officer for Queensland. He's funded by the federal government to run a program called Bridging the Divide, which is linking families in treatment with support. Obviously, we work with the collective wisdom of the groups that we run, and we help support our volunteers by training them and giving them ongoing education. So, what's our model? What's the structure of it? Okay, well, we don't deal with fantasy. We don't deal with the ideal, and that's sometimes a bit difficult because families want miracles. They want action. They want to get back to how it was. They want to get rid of drugs, and we sometimes have to battle quite hard to actually tell people what reality is about drug use. We focus on the person, that's the family member's own strengths, courage and love. We acknowledge their survival to date. By the time families come to us, they're usually pretty worn out. We don't get people coming when kids are experimenting or when people are having an occasional episode of drug use. By the time they reach our telephone line or our support groups, it's pretty entrenched, and they're, if not dependent drug users involved, they're very, very, very hectic drug users, to say the least. We focus on self-care, so we encourage people to look after themselves and to have a life separately from the drug use situation. We also believe that nobody knows more about the drug user than the family member. Experts, whether they're academics, doctors, drug and alcohol workers, researchers, they know a lot, they have a lot of skills, and they can be utilized, those skills can be utilized, but nobody actually knows what makes a person tick better than the family themselves. Often because of their hopes and desires, that's a bit fragmented and a bit worn down, but if we can give them the coping skills necessary, which we've proven we can do, then they become a really effective tool in progress for the drug user. The families are the experts. We don't believe that any family ever does the wrong thing. So when people have to choose whether to throw their kids out or whether to keep them at home with chaos, whether to give them money for drugs, whether not to give them money for drugs, we don't take any position on that. But we help facilitate them making their decisions. So we go through the options and consequences that they face. We maybe encourage them to look for one or two more options if they're only looking at two. And then the consequences for everybody of each of those options. And by going through that process, it usually then becomes apparent to them which is the best one they can do to live with. Not necessarily the bright shining star that stands above all the others, but just the one that they can live with the most. And once families make that decision, they then are empowered. Of course, we're using motivational interviewing techniques to do this. And so people never have to regret any decision they make. They don't have to stick with any decision they make. It's an ongoing process. And we use the process of action learning, of planning, doing and reviewing, so that you know what you do today, you may do something differently in 3 months' time. It was right today. It's still right in 3 months' time. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. I was running a support group many years ago now when heroin was a big problem. And I had a woman turn up at a group. She was a regular member. She plunked down in the chair and she said, "Oh my God," she said, "I don't know whether I dare tell you this." And the group said, go on, you've come with it, so tell us. And she said, "I've started buying drugs for my son." And she said, "He's just chaotic. He's out of control. I don't know where he is half the time. I know he's probably doing robberies." And she said, "I thought the best way I could deal with it was to find out where his dealer was, go and buy the drugs, keep them at home and allow him to use them day by day." As she was explaining all this, and there was a lot of empathy from the group, a woman over here gasped. So I allowed the empathy to continue, and then I went to this other lady and I said, sounds like you have an issue with that." And she said, "Oh my God, I couldn't do that. That's against all my religious values. It's against my ethics. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night." And so, again, this woman got a whole lot of empathy. And the consensus of the group was they're both right. We didn't say one was right, one was wrong. They both decided to do whatever they could do in their own circumstances, and that was right by us. The irony of that is that a few weeks later, the second woman came into the group and said, "I'm doing what you're doing. It was getting out of control. I thought about what you said, and I've now started to buy the drugs and allow him to use them." And the woman over here said, "Well, isn't that funny, because I've stopped. I couldn't cope with it. It was driving me mad. He was using outside the house on top of it." So, and again, we just took the group decision that it was okay for both of them to do what they were doing. They were still both right. So that's our attitude. We don't believe in right or wrongs. Families carry a lot of guilt and blame. Society puts a lot of guilt and blame on them. So how they're dealing with it. Not everybody would agree with our model there, but that's what we believe. We don't look backwards. We acknowledge the survival today, and whatever they've done in the past, whether it's worked or not, whether they're happy about the consequences or not, we just say, you did the best you could. We're talking about families who are pretty committed and pretty involved. We're not talking about families who don't care. And so we just say, look, whatever you did back then doesn't matter. It's where you are now that matters, and where you go from here. And we don't compare ourselves with other people in the group. In any group, there's going to be a range of situations, a range of drugs used, a range of what people see as negatives. The person whose son is, at risk of death from heroin is no different to us from the Italian family who are really distressed because there's a bit of cannabis use going on. Our attitude is nothing hurts like your own toothache. You don't have to compare yourself to that family. We're all the same here. We're struggling with an issue, and we'll help you to cope with it in whatever way we can. So we use solution-focused brief therapy. Here's a textbook in 3 lines. Basics of solution-focused brief therapy is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if they're doing okay, don't bring new stuff into play. Once you know what's working, do more of it. And if it's not working, try something different. We acknowledge distress, but we focus on success. And then with action learning, that continuous cycle of planning, acting, and reviewing. How do we define a family? Well, in this day and age, a family can be anything. Not many nuclear families. They're a thing of the past. But we do get a few. Of course, extended family members are part of the family. Blended families, single parent families, non-parental primary carers, partners and friends. So the simple definition of a family is anyone who cares about that person. And we've struggled with this a bit when we've gone to visit treatment centres, because often they focus on blood relatives, parents, and in their intake they say, do you want your family involved? Well, by that, the treatment centre often means the parents or the partner. And we've tried to encourage treatment centres to broaden their definition, and with some success, I might tell you. A lot of services are now opening up that definition. The other thing we've noted with that is that if the person coming into treatment says, no, I don't want my family involved, and that box gets ticked, for a lot of treatment services, that's it. The family then can get no information, can get no access. They don't even get confirmation if the person's in there. There's a service in New South Wales, and I think up here in Queensland, called We Help Ourselves, who have now realised that that's crazy. So they have a process of reviewing that every month or so. When you came in, you said you didn't want your family involved. Is that still the case? And again, if it's still the case, it's still a no. But if they've thought about it and changed their mind, then it opens up that possibility. And we know that the more family are included, as difficult as it might be for such a treatment service, it's actually a better outcome. We've also acknowledged that there are three types of families out there, and we largely speak to one group, a little bit from the second group, and hardly any in the third group. And this is a challenge for a service like ours. So the majority of people we see are from the engaged group. They're families that are active, motivated, and well educated. Don't apologize for this, but they tend to be Anglo, middle class, well educated families. And I suppose they make up about 75% of the people who contact us. The second group we call engaged but disadvantaged. So this is where families are, and the person contacting us is active and motivated but have barriers. Some of the barriers would be cultural, language of course, and literacy, and would include a lot of the CALD groups and the Indigenous groups. What we've discovered with this group is if we can break the barrier down for that family, they engage really well. The problem in the first place is breaking the barrier, whether it's a language barrier, whether it's a cultural or religious barrier. Some particularly Asian groups, the religion thing is a big thing. Very patriarchal, a lot of these groups too. So, and most of the people who come to us for help are the mothers. So they do it secretly, and they're going against sometimes what their husbands would want them to do. But we have found that if we can engage with them, that they will engage really well with us. The third group, we don't often see. It's the disengaged groups. It's where there's a history of intergenerational problems, where the parents themselves may have substance or other problems that they're dealing with, where there's a mistrust of services, even ones like ours that are out there to try and help them. They link us in with the government and with other bad experiences they've had. There's a lot of mistrust. And sometimes they're just not inclined. They don't care. We've struggled with how to engage with that group over the years, and we almost made a breakthrough in New South Wales where we became part of the youth drug court program, and we were going to be part of the team, and it was going to be mandated that families of people going through the youth drug court program would have to come and do some sessions with us. Just as we became part of the team, the funding was pulled, and there's no longer a youth drug court in New South Wales. But there is possibilities, and we haven't given up on that, but we are, whether we like it or not, really working with mostly engaged people. You don't know this. I don't need to go through this, do I? Everybody knows this? Yeah. So this is the stages of change for drug users. We do a lot of educating families about this. And this is actually really, really good for families to know. Their belief is that they're in a black hole where there's no movement and there's no change. When we can point out these changes, they can see then where their drug using person is. They can identify that there's a process going on, and they can see it as a roadmap, and they can see that there is progress happening. So that's very useful for us to inform families about that stages of change. But we've also developed a cycle of change for families. So this is happening parallel to the drug user stages. Families are going through their own stages, and I think as workers this is really important for you to understand where a family might be at when you encounter them. So the first stage for a family, which sort of coincides with the happy user stage, is denial. So if there's a honeymoon period in drug use, this is it. The users in happy user, they don't have a problem, they don't see any issues, they're happily consuming, and the family doesn't know it's going on. So everybody's happy at this stage. There is a bit of a dialogue occurs between families and the drug user in this stage, where they tell you what you want to hear and you hear what you want to hear. And again, everybody's happy. And we point out to families that the user's not telling them what they want to hear because they're trying to be nasty. They're actually trying to protect the family usually by not giving them the full information. People come out of denial with drug use usually in a big way. Usually something significant happens. An overdose, an arrest, a large sum of money going missing, finding a syringe in the bedroom, something fairly significant that kind of clicks people very quickly out of denial. For some people it's a long process with lots of small things, but when people come out of denial, they automatically switch to this emotional stage. And I think this is what was problematic for treatment services for a long time, that when families were trying to engage with treatment services, they were in this emotional stage, so they were quite volatile. And whilst the emotions they strongly feel are things like fear, guilt and grief, what they're actually expressing usually is anger, which is a secondary emotion that masks these primary ones. When my son Damien came to me and admitted he had these problems, I went through these really strong feelings of fear, grief and guilt. And, we've discovered that they're the common three. But often we express anger. And when we're on the telephone line, if somebody's been very angry on the phone, what we try and do is to work out what other emotion is behind that. And that helps us then to be able to connect with them more easily. We can link into their fear or their guilt. The emotional stage doesn't last long, because then most families move to the control stage, the fix-it stage. Now we've divided control into two types of control, and we call them masculine or feminine. That's not being sexist, it's just descriptive. And it's not always the male, the father, who is the masculine controller, and the female, the mother, who is the feminine controller, but it often is. Single parents, for instance, would flick from one to another. There'd be masculine controller one week and then feminine controller the next. So what do I mean by that? Well, masculine control is about having a problem and getting rid of it, solving it, fixing it. So it involves a lot of black and white language, a lot of ultimatums, a lot of, do it or else. Feminine control, I use the analogy of a juggler. So that the feminine controller has a lot of balls in the air and they're running around trying to keep them going. So one of the balls would be the drug user and their safety and well-being. Keeping that ball in the air might involve colluding with them in some ways, hiding stuff from the rest of the family, particularly the husband, rescuing them from problems that they get into, maybe sometimes giving them money. The next ball would be the partner, trying to keep them calm and happy. The other kids in the family, they've got their needs and you've got to look after them as well. Then there's the household to manage and all that belongs there. And then there's maybe even work. So they've got all these things running around and they're running around trying to keep them all going. And in the meantime, often becoming over-responsible, over-involved, rescuing, and controlling. So we don't judge people on their control because it's normal. But in the scheme of things, that sort of control, whether it's masculine or feminine, doesn't work. And one of the things we try and do is bring people together. So the masculine controller becomes a little bit more flexible in attitude, a bit grayer in their thinking, and the feminine controller puts down a few boundaries and develops some assertiveness. And they work as a couple rather than separately, creating win-win rather than win-lose, which is often what happens if they stick to their form of control. As I say, control doesn't work, so we then end up in this fourth stage, which is chaos. Probably the worst of all for a family. What the hell's wrong with us? You know, we're intelligent people. We've been doing our best. We've tried everything. We've tried the soft approach. We've tried the hard approach. We've tried the tough love. It's just not working. It's your fault. You've always been too bloody hard on him. You did this. Don't blame me if you hadn't let him get away with so-and-so. So often in this chaotic stage, the rest of the family system's starting to shake. Some of the other siblings are saying, I'm out of here. Nobody's listening to me. So it's a very, very negative stage for people to be in. And of course, they don't like being there. So they often go back to one of the earlier stages. And people will go round and round and round these stages in an attempt to try and fix it. This chaotic stage reminds me a bit of governments and how they deal with it. It's kind of macrocosm, microcosm. You know, we fought the war on drugs. We've put all these millions of dollars into it. It didn't work. We just didn't do it hard enough. Let's go and do it again. This time, we'll build a wall across the Mexican border. You know what I mean? And families are doing this too. They're going round and round and round. The good news is there is a fifth stage. And that's what we are endeavouring to educate people on with the work we do at FDS. If people just keep going round these four negative stages, they will end up in defeat or despair. And we can actually measure that. It's about 12 years for most families that they can cope with stuff going round and round and round without support, and then they'll usually disengage. But if we can come in to play at any time after the drug use is discovered and start to give them some of the strategies we're talking about, we can lead to an upward momentum and success. The problem with success as we define it is that it's not what the family wants. All the families we ever encounter only really want one thing, and that's drug-free. And our model doesn't guarantee that. So what we do offer is that they can have strategies in place, personal and interpersonal, having access to quality support, taking care of your emotional, physical and spiritual well-being, having better relationships and better communication in the family, more honesty, but it may or may not mean the user's drug-free. So I wrote those words in the year 2000, and to be honest with you, when I wrote may or may not mean the user is drug-free, I was thinking to myself, it probably means they won't be. Now that was 15 years ago, 16 years ago nearly. I've changed my mind a bit on that. There's still no guarantee. But obviously in that time we worked with a lot of families over a lot of time period. And we have seen people become drug-free, lots of people, lots and lots and lots of people. We've seen people, if they haven't become drug-free, get control over their drug use, reduce it, give away some substances even if they continue to use other substances. So I can now confidently say that if you adopt this model, it won't take 3 months, it won't maybe take 6 months or 2 years, it might take 5 years, but there will be progression. And in a lot of cases, there will be what you really want. Now, of course, still not guaranteed. And 3 years ago, a mother whose son had been using heroin and who had been a member of FDS for 10 years, only child, died from an overdose. So, you know, worst possible scenario, only child, absolutely grief-stricken. But she got up in the church at the funeral and said, if it hadn't been for family drug support, I wouldn't have had the last 10 years. So even in that very worst of circumstances, she could see that what she was now experiencing would have happened a lot earlier, and she wouldn't have had that time where she has had a very good relationship with him. So that's the model. It's not what every family wants, particularly when they're in control. It's the last thing they want. And some people go away from our meetings quite disillusioned about what they've heard. But often they come back when they move on to the next stage. 10 minutes, okay. We'll flick through some of these. So that's what we do in the coping stage. We give them education, valuing self, building skills, communication, workable boundaries, letting go as well, of course. I'll demonstrate this little metaphor. Before I was involved in the drug arena, I was a marriage counsellor, and I did a lot of work with divorce and separation. I used to run a group called Rebuilding for people who were coming out of divorce. And I used this metaphor in that arena, and I found it transferred nicely to dealing with drugs. So when something terrible happens in life, it's like you've been pushed out onto a tightrope. You know, that's what happens with divorce. It's what happens with drug use. And your first instinct is to get back to the platform that you've been pushed out from. So people going through divorce will often want to go back to the relationship, even if it's a crap relationship. It's familiar, it's well known, it's better than the insecurity and uncertainty of being out there. Same with drug use. Families always want to get back to how it was. But no matter what you do, you find yourself on the tightrope. The next thing families do is they look for safety nets. Get them into treatment. Get them into a rehab. That'll do it. And there's all these ICE things going on around the country, and there's all these demands for more treatment. Mandatory treatment. You know, and the reality is, of course, it's not going to work for 95% of the people who want it. But it's one of the safety nets that people look for. They look for miracle cures. In the early days of heroin, it was rapid detox. Now it's naltrexone implants. And I get people ringing me up all the time. We've got a cure for addiction. Doesn't work. You find yourself back on the tightrope. Another safety net is chuck them out, let them hit rock bottom. People think that's going to work. Of course it doesn't. So no matter what happens, people find themselves on the tightrope. Now, our little friend up there has got something in his hands. And if you're a tightrope walker, that's an essential piece of equipment. It's your balance pole. It's the thing that keeps you going. And what families often do when they're stuck out on this tightrope is they throw away their balance pole and stop using it. Now, what is the balance pole? It's the stuff that keeps you going. It's your relationships, it's your friendships, it's your work, it's your hobbies, it's your interests, it's your faith, it's your music, it's your yoga, it's reading, it's counselling, it's all that stuff. So one of the things we are encouraging people to do is to pick up the balance pole. and start utilizing it. And, you know, it's slow progress across that tightrope, but about 2/3 of the way across, people realize that it's actually easier to keep going forward than it is to go backwards. And the progress then starts to get much easier. And that's called the letting go stage. And that's where they stop manipulating, where they stop directing, where they stop getting in people's face and telling them they have to give it up. So that's you know, just some of the things we teach people. So no solutions or quick fixes, no advice, no rights or wrongs. Families do the best they can. Families can gain new skills. Working in groups is really important. That's why we place a lot in group work. Stepping Stones is our 27-hour program. It works. It's been evaluated. There's a paper you can read about it. We've now done 16, more than 100 participants. And it not only works in getting people in an advanced state through the course, but we do a follow-up in 6 months' time, and we find that not only have they not gone backwards, but in most cases they've gone forwards. So that's available in Queensland. It's now got a gold award because of the research. That's what the process that we go through. So we take people through all those various what formerly were barriers, and we turn them into stepping stones. So I've pretty well told you about this, but this is just information about that. We have a tool that's also been recognized by the research. These are just recommendations. Stepping Forward's another course we do. Dom runs that here in Queensland. It's a 2-hour version. It's not the same. It's not as interactive and obviously not as intense, but it's a good intro for families. And we run normally 3 modules. We've just introduced a new one on ICE. So we do one on stages of change, self-care and life balance. We do one on communication, and we do one on basic drug and alcohol information. And we've got these in play too: treatment and recovery, boundaries, conflict resolution. But we've also got one on ICE, which Dom's offering at the moment. Because we haven't got much time, and I know you want to maybe ask a few questions. Yeah, we'll stop there.
I've just got a couple of questions from the webinar participants about the tools you mentioned and the questionnaire. They're internal tools that you've developed, or are they external ones that are available?
They're ones that we've developed. We are open to partnerships with Stepping Stones. We're open to working with other organisations in delivering it. We've had some negative experiences though in the past where we've collaborated with people, formed partnerships. They've taken the course and changed it and reduced it and taken away some of its effectiveness in our view. So we're now very conscious of making sure that the intellectual property is, you know, well regarded, and we have some control over that. So if people wanted to do stepping stones, they'd have to collaborate with us, and there'd have to be a couple of conditions. But we're very open to it. The tool applies only to stepping stones, I believe. If anybody wanted to look at that, we're very happy to show them. But whether it would be useful to them in another arena, I'm not sure.
And also, just quickly, because there is so much interest in methamphetamine at the moment, how have you seen that reflected in your stats on your family, like your support line?
Like everybody else, we've seen a huge increase. 2 years ago, crystal meth was 18% of the calls that we took. This financial year, it was up to 34%. So it's nearly doubled. A couple of other things I will say though. Speed use has gone from 15% of the calls to about 4% of the calls. So that indicates to us that a lot of people using ice have switched from speed, not necessarily new people. I am really distressed about the media hype and even the government reaction. I know everybody says it's good, it brings money. I don't know whether that's a good thing when it really scares people, because a lot of the phone calls we are getting are from people who have people who are using ice, but not necessarily in trouble with it, but the information that's put out is really scaring them to death. And I think some of the, like the Four Corners programs are just diabolical, where they took long-term polydrug users who have been out of control for a long, long time. Now they're using ice and make that look as if this is what ice does, when in fact it's got a lot to do with the other stuff. The other thing that we've observed in talking to families who are dealing with ice is treating it is comparatively easy. And yet it's supposed to be the hardest drug, the most addictive drug. That's not our experience. We've had a lot of people who've been very successful by simply making a decision to stop. And then the actual treatment of it's been relatively easy from that point on. I know it's a drug that lures people back, and I know a lot of families are having really difficult situations to deal with. So I'm not downplaying that, but it's not as difficult. It's a drug. It's like any other drug. The other thing I will say too is that our stats for the last 4 months have indicated a drop in calls from ice. Not massively, but instead of going up and up and up, it's peaked and it's starting to come down, whereas we've seen heroin double in the last 6 months. Again, not significant. It's come from 4% to 8%. But if you look at what's happening in the United States, that's exactly what happened. Ice peaked in 2009. It's down by 50%. Heroin has skyrocketed. So I'm just cautious about all this.
Any questions from the floor? Yes, up the back.
Just wondering if you have any idea why heroin skyrocketed in the States?
Well, we know that the most significant reason is the switch from legal opiates, which have become difficult to obtain for people who were getting them quite easily, by doctor shopping, and they've made the use of them more difficult to inject. So that's definitely one of the reasons. But I do believe there's also a correlation with ice and the decline. It's like always happens. One drug goes up, then comes down, and something else takes its place. And the other thing, of course, is that in our region, opium production's also skyrocketing. So that opium's going somewhere.
Thanks very much, Tony. Have you got any comments about the move to have marijuana medicalized? How's that going to impact on families?
I can't see anything at all negative about that. I thought you were going to ask me about marijuana generally being legalized, and I'd be supportive of that too. It's estimated to be a $5 billion industry in Australia at the moment in the hands of dealers and crims, and we could be getting some beneficial tax from that and use it for beneficial purposes. It's one area where parts of the United States are leading the way and we're way behind. So, but medical marijuana, that's a no-brainer. It's helping people, and even if 1 or 2 people might be misusing it, so what? If it's helping a lot of people to live longer and have better lives, then we should have it.
Tony, there was a question whether the evaluation of stepping stones has been published, and if so...
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. And if you want to contact me, whoever is asking that question, I can give people a reference. But yeah, it has been published this year.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other questions? No. Well, if you could join me in thanking Tony for his time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. It was a great pleasure to have you up here. We look forward to talking with you a bit later now. There are some resources up here, some pamphlets, brochures, and sample resources you may wish to have a look through. Next week I'll be doing a little presentation on drug checking. So this is just a bit of a summary of some of the different drug checking or pill testing models that are in existence around the world. So I'll be providing a bit of a summary on that. So if you could please join us at 10 o'clock next Wednesday. Otherwise, thanks a lot for your mornings and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks everyone.